Tanchi, everyone. I'm Andrée Forest. I'm the project coordinator of the Manitoba Research Alliance, which is at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. The Manitoba Research Alliance is a community academic partnership that's supported by SSHRC, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, and the Community-Based Research Training Centre that's organizing this event is a project of the Manitoba Research Alliance. The MRA and the CCPA have been funding research that tackles some of the most wicked problems, helping to push the policy agenda in Manitoba and beyond. And we do that in part by supporting researchers, students, and community organizations to do the same through research. So a session like this one is one such opportunity. Before we get started, I wanted to acknowledge the lands that we're on. So even though we're on a virtual platform today, it's important, I think, to ground into where we are. So I'm actually coming to you from the unceded territories of the Sialt, Tudeka, and Sinixt nations today in British Columbia. So those are unceded territories. And while most of you are coming from Winnipeg, I want to recognize the lands there too, and the Indigenous nations who've been stewards there since time immemorial, the Anishinaabe, Innu, Oji, Cree, Dene, and Dakota, and also the birthplace of the Métis Nation, of which I am a member. So wherever you are, I invite you to recognize where you are and the land on which you are, the water, where your energy comes from, and really take a moment to ground yourself in that before we get started. So beyond recognizing land and water, I also want to recognize all of those who do incredible research that seeks to kind of push against the ongoing colonial policies in Canada. The MRA and the CCPA have been lucky to challenge that work in lots of ways, and we wish for all of the work that you do to continue to do the same. So the Community-Based Research Training Centre that's putting on this event, as I mentioned, is a partnership between the Manitoba Research Alliance and the University of Winnipeg. Our sessions are also supported by the University of Manitoba Centre for Social Science, Research and Policy. And we're so lucky to have Dagen, who I'm sure you've heard from before, who's our stellar coordinator. And I'll pass it off to him to do some housekeeping and introduce us to our speaker today. So over to you, Dagen, and nice to see you here.
Hey everyone, thank you, Andrée. So yeah, in terms of housekeeping, as I said, session is recorded, but that's mostly because this should be a really stellar and useful session, and we want to make sure that it's available for people to review afterwards as well. But if there are any questions about that at any point, please just reach out to me and we'll sort something out. I will just let you know we have one last session planned for sort of the fall term, or one last more information-based session. So that will be with Jeannie Kerr and Ray Silvius on November 8th. And it'll be on the topic of ethics and practice of interviewing. So going beyond just the more formal ethics requirements and the methodology of interviewing, but really what do you encounter in an interviewing room? How do you approach that in a good way? So I've put the link to that in the chat. As well, I think it's really great that we have a smaller session today, because that gives lots of room for us to chat about how do we access data that's beyond the paywall, how do we make sure information is accessible, and joining us is Brianne Selman, who is the scholarly communications librarian at the U of Winnipeg and specializes in helping make information freely and widely accessible, and is just a fantastic resource. And we've had some great conversations outside of just this session around what is the process of making data and research able to be found, able to be accessed by everyone. And so, yeah, I think it's a great opportunity. So I want to encourage folks to ask questions, whether that's broader questions around democratizing research or more specific to the work that you're doing. And I think, yeah, we have a really exciting opportunity because it's a bit of a smaller group today. So with all of that, I want to pass it on to Brianne to start us off. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. And thanks to everyone involved. I want to acknowledge that today I'm actually in Treaty 3 territory, which is the treaty signed between the province of Manitoba and the Saulteaux people, as well as the Métis people. It's actually the only numbered treaty that the Métis are actually signatories to, not just part of negotiating. And it's variously known as the Northwest Angle Treaty or the Paywall Treaty. The Paywall Treaty being the traditional name for it in recognition of the things that were agreed to orally that never made it into the written treaty of number 3. So I'm on Saulteaux land and very close to, people might know the Sandy Saulteaux Centre, which is quite close to where I live as well. And I just wanted to check in. I know that Dagen's setting us up as we've got fewer people so we can all be really interactive, but we could also not be really interactive. So if people feel like, yeah, they want to be involved, get involved in either the chat or unmute at any time, that's totally fine. If you do feel like you want to be like really interactive, give me a thumbs up right now. Otherwise, I can also just kind of present and we can all have our lunch and, well, I can't have my lunch, I already had it, but we can, go with it. Looks like so far people are kind of feeling chill, yeah, and hungry. Okay, the one thing that I would like some help with, so I'll limit the interactivity to this one thing. I'm gonna do some demonstrations, and it's always fun / a challenge for me if people give me some topic ideas. So if there's something that you're working on, a project, or like a question or a subject that you're interested in, just type it into the chat and I will try to pick one that I can maybe use as an example as we go. But I'm going to switch over to my presentation right now and I'll check in as I go with that. So I'm a librarian, but I'm here to teach you how to do things when you don't have access to the library. So some of this is relevant for people who are sort of in the larger community, but it's also become very relevant during COVID because of course, normally Winnipeg likes to have very open doors and have people come and use our library, but that's a lot more difficult right now with the COVID protocols. So this is a way to kind of find some things outside the library, but that are still going to be reliable and that kind of thing. Sorry, and academic and trustworthy. The first question that I think is really important to get into actually is why is it so hard? Because it's hard. It's not easy to find free quality scholarly sources. And there's a couple of reasons why it's so complicated. The first is that there's a vastly inflated number of scientific academic research and report every year. So this graph shows that real exponential increase where we started with 500,000 in the mid-70s articles published every year, and now we're close to 4 million every year. So there's just more people writing more stuff. And part of the reason for that is because there's a lot more money involved. So surprise, surprise, the reason this is hard is because there's profit to be made in it. And so no one wants you to get things for free if they can charge you. This is just an example of a really small subset of Canadian libraries and what we pay for those library subscriptions, which for this small subset, I think 20-something universities, only for this list of databases, they pay over $82 million a year. So there's a lot of money to be made charging people to access the stuff that academics and scholars and community researchers too are writing. So that is why it's complicated. It's understandable that it's complicated. It's incredibly frustrating to be told, yes, you can get this article if you pay us $49 for 24 hours worth of access. But the reason they do it is because people are willing to pay. When it comes to finding this kind of information, there's sort of this traditional model that we used to use more in the print world and in the library world, where things are very neatly organized. It's still relevant for the web. I'll kind of get into why later on. But this traditional model says, oh, we've got this nice, neat classification scheme. We use the Library of Congress in academic libraries, or the Dewey Decimal System in public libraries. we've got this nice controlled vocabulary. And what the controlled vocabulary is that librarians go through, they actually read the article, they read the book, and they assign a subject heading to it. So even if the author themselves doesn't use that keyword or that subject term, if the work is about it, they assign that subject heading to it. So one example I like to use here is that we talk about climate change now, but I'm old. And I remember when it was global warming or holes in the ozone layer that we were particularly concerned about. So librarians will go through and make sure that all of those topics are linked together, even if they're not necessarily using the same terms. And then finally, things are organized into things like bibliographies or indexes or databases as well. And this can get really confusing because sometimes we think we're looking at what we would call a database that actually contains the full text, but really what we're looking at is just something that gathers all of the research out there on a given subject, but it doesn't have the actual contents of that research there, just the titles, and just lets you know that it was written. If you're familiar with Netflix versus IMDb, it's sort of like that. Netflix is an actual database where everything in it you can watch at that time. IMDb, however, is a listing of every person ever who was in any kind of film or TV show. You can't watch them on IMDb, but you can find out that they exist. And then in this traditional model, we also have different types of literature. So, you know, we have encyclopedias, dictionaries, monographs, which is what librarians like to call books, periodicals, which are journals or magazines, things that come out in some sort of periodical way, manuscripts, which can also be books, just to confuse things like correspondence, and then what we call gray literature sometimes, reports, white papers, really useful things that haven't necessarily gone through an academic process, but still have a lot of valuable information in them. And there's also like reviews and meta-analysis and systematic reviews. So all of that gets put into what we structure in the library, but that doesn't necessarily happen with the things that we find on the web. Now, obtaining full texts is a lot less about going and finding the paper copy of a book and more about trying to find digital copies. There's a variety of options for you. You can physically access anything we have at the U Winnipeg at our library after COVID. Unfortunately, COVID protocols right now mean that U Winnipeg campus is only open to U Winnipeg students. You could potentially, if you're working with any U Winnipeg people, or the same thing for U of M, talk to them about getting access to campus, but unfortunately it is shut right now. However, the Winnipeg Public Library branches are all open to the public again, and they have a large variety of databases, some of which are only accessible if you're physically in their library. I'll talk about that a little bit. Then the other options, which are more digital, are through open access repositories or aggregators. These are the main kinds of tools that I'm going to show you to find research that's out there, full text, digitally on the web. You can also always find things if you contact the author. Under Canadian copyright law, we have exceptions called fair dealing. And that means that for your own purposes of private study or research, people are freely able to share things that are paywalled with you. You can ask for it directly from the authors, or if it's something that U Winnipeg or U of M subscribes to, you can find someone on that campus and request it then, and they should be able to provide you with a copy of it for fair dealing. And certainly you can contact me if things like that come up. The final way to get full texts are through things like previews. So Google Books, you know, where students will cite the 3 pages that were a free preview in Google Books as their source. But there's also lots of piracy sites out there that do contain full text. So LibGen is one of the common ones for finding full books, and Sci-Hub is another common one for finding full articles. And there's lots of discussion and debate about how they get those things, how illegal is it, how harmful is it. But for some people, that's just simply the only option for getting the things that they need to conduct their research. So on to the fun stuff, which are the actual tools. The #1 tool that I recommend is something called Unpaywall. It's actually a browser extension. There's other ways to access it, but the easiest way is if you're using your own computer or a computer that you have administrative abilities for, you can install this, and it just sits very quietly in the background of your browsing, and it doesn't share any private information. I'm fairly paranoid about that stuff, and it's very safe from that perspective. But what it does do is if you ever come across the page that says pay $49.95 to read this for the next 24 hours, it looks for a free and open version of it. Most of those free and open versions of it are hosted on things like the university institutional repositories. So we have one at Winnipeg that I manage, and we encourage faculty to put a copy of every article they write into that repository. So that's what Paywall looks through, is this global network of repositories to try and find a free version of that article. I use it daily. It's in my browser. And what it is when you're on an academic article, and it's very good at recognizing when you're on an article or not. This little gray, if you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, there's this little gray button, and it shows you gray if there's no options available. So for this one, there was no option available. And it shows you a green unlock if there is a free option available, and you can click on it and we'll take you to the free option instead. The other similar tool to this, I don't use this one as much, but it's very similar. It's called the Open Access button. And it does a similar thing. It shows you if there's a free open access version of it. The one thing that it does that Paywall doesn't do is if you can't find a version of the article, it actually gives you an option to email the author directly and request that they send you a copy. So it has that ability to sort of follow up further. This is an example of what it shows you. Oh, look, we found a free article, and then it gives you the URL for where that free article is found. I know that this is saying what this URL is showing is that this is an institutional repository in the UK. So we know that it's the accepted manuscript version of that article. There are also ways to access databases for free. So as I mentioned, the Winnipeg Public Library has databases. So they have Academic Search Premier. They have EBSCOhost. They're smaller versions than what we have at Winnipeg, but you can access them through the library. And those ones you can access digitally. You just need your public library card, and you can sign in to get into those databases. They also have ancestry and sort of genealogical stuff as well. The one that they do have that you have to access on site is called Grant Connect. And it's actually a giant database of different kinds of community organization grants, Winnipeg focused too. So that is very helpful if you're working on a kind of project that might be eligible for grants, but you do have to go to a physical branch in order to use it, and you can just use it on their computers there. And I believe that's the case for their newspaper ones as well. So if you're trying to find free press articles or things like that, and you don't have a subscription, WPL will give you access to it, I think just on site, though, because it's very expensive. The other one that I use, again, just from home when I'm just browsing around at home, is something called dimensions.ai. That's actually like the website name. And here's where I'm going to do a live demo. Let me just see, did anyone have any suggestions for what to look for? Sorry, I can't get the chat open. Is there anything in the chat? Anyone want to unmute? Here we go. Vacant land and buildings in Winnipeg, housing policies and the impact of this on homelessness. Okay, thank you. Let's look at, I'm just going to do really general housing policies. Looking at vacant land is something you have to do generally through the city sites, but it's not well done. Okay. Hopefully you can now all see Dimensions. I'm going to what they call their free app, which is a search interface. And it will show you when you go to it, see what the current count of publications are. 122 million publications are available.
Sorry to interrupt, Brianne.
Oh, yeah.
I think we're still just on the slideshow. So
Okay.
you might have to stop the screen share and then share the other page.
When I have it minimized, it's hard to tell what's going on here. Sorry for this pause. Please edit this out.
I'll do a seamless jump cut. It'll be fine.
Yeah. I can't get to the full screen for some reason. There we go. Okay. So let's see. Did it jump now? Are we seeing dimensions search interface now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, looks good.
All right. So I'm going to search housing policy and homeless. Sorry. And as I said, you can see there's 122 million articles in this. There's also 10 million data sets. So that's a lot of different data sets that are available. And it also allows you to search things like patents. I don't know if you're doing stuff with patents. So just doing a really quick search on housing policy and homelessness, I'm getting 96,000 articles. So lots of choice. And all of these are open access, which means all of these, when I click on them, I'm going to be able to directly read the article. So Court and Post Finds is a feature of the Homelessness Incarceration Network. Comparison of state hospitals with housing and urban development estimates of homeless people. It's going to be a very large mixed bag. You can see here that I can also limit it though. I can say I'm only interested in really recent stuff. So stuff from 2021, where there's 6,000 articles, or 2020, where there's 10,000 articles. I can also say I'm only interested in it from a medical or health perspective. So I can limit it to medical and health science, or specifically public health and health science. I could say I'm more interested in a policy perspective, so I'm going to limit it to policy and administration. And these are those controlled vocabularies that I talked about before, that sort of categorizing that someone else has done to try to gather them together. So here now, preventing gender-based homelessness in Canada during the COVID-19 pandemic and beyond, the need to account for violence against women already sounds very relevant and interesting because it's showing that there's overlap between different policy areas. Proactive strategies to alleviate homelessness, the systems approach, homelessness, health, and the policy process. This one's a literature review. So literature reviews are quite handy because they provide a summary of as much of the research that this particular group could find. They're a really good way to find out if people have been doing studies in that area, what the general consensus is, those kinds of things. So all kinds of ways that we can narrow down our search just within the Dimensions database. We can also say, I only want to read articles. I only want to read books. Proceedings are like talks at conferences. Preprints are a little bit of a tricky thing. Preprints means that it's something that the authors have published, but it hasn't been through a process yet where people have edited, looked it over, peer reviewed it to see if it's sort of valid or not. So there can be a lot of really interesting information in preprints, but you do have to be a little bit more careful. During COVID, we were seeing a lot of things in preprints that once it was actually looked at with more scrutiny, the study didn't hold up or those kinds of things. So they can be a little bit reader beware, I guess. You can also see it gets even more specific in terms of fields of research here. There's actually applied economics options for this, or philosophy and religious studies options. If you know particular researchers, you can look at their stuff. That one I don't use quite as frequently. But yeah, Dimensions sort of gives you a lot of options to kind of click around and narrow it down without necessarily changing what you've typed into the search box, which I will talk about a little bit as I go. Now I'm going to try and switch my screen again, so wish me luck. All right, so that's dimensions.ai. It's a really good starting place. The other one is lens.org, and it's a really similar interface to dimensions.ai, but weirdly, they have slightly different areas of overlap. So if you're trying to be really comprehensive, go to both. Otherwise, I would suggest just kind of playing around with them and seeing which one you prefer. I'm gonna switch over quickly to lens.org just to show you it. So they say they've got, I think, slightly more articles than dimensions.ai, and I'd put in housing policy and homelessness. And I'm not going to put anything in for now, but it will show me, okay, it's giving me patents. I don't want patents. Sorry, second tab there is scholarly works. Housing policy and homelessness for a nice, cheerful search. So for scholarly works, it's showing 8,399. And again, there's the same sort of options here to change it based on institution, author, where they're coming from. So the region, there's a lot published in the United Kingdom and the United States. So if you want to refine it and limit it specifically to Canada, you can do that. It doesn't necessarily mean it's about Canada. It just means that whoever wrote the article is based in Canada, which usually means it's about Canada. So here we go. Housing and harm reduction. What's the role of harm reduction in addressing homelessness? Housing and homelessness in Indigenous communities of Canada's North. Housing, homelessness, and poverty. Homelessness in Canada and New Zealand, a comparative perspective. Again, lots of relevant results. That is lens.org. I find that there's sort of 6 of one, half dozen of the other between those two, but they are different results. So it's always good to have both tools at your availability. The final one I'm going to show you, I suspect everybody's familiar with. It's where I actually start a lot of my searches, even though I'm working in the library all the time, and that's Google Scholar. Google Scholar kind of, again, has a slightly different overlap than Dimensions and Lens, but similar stuff in all of them. Google Scholar searches those institutional repositories I talked about. It also searches things like ResearchGate and academia.edu, which are great places for papers, but they are places that require a login. That login is free, but like anything else on the web, they are sort of collecting your data when you log in. So that's sort of my little caveat about ResearchGate and academia.edu is because you're required to log in, there's a little bit more data tracking going on with them. But Google Scholar also has lots of other sources that it pulls from. And a lot of the time, Google Scholar will actually have multiple versions of the same article. So even though the link over here on the right is to ResearchGate, I can see that there's 4 versions of this first article, and I could actually choose if I didn't want to go to ResearchGate to go to a different one. So back to the real life. If we search housing, I'm trying to do this the same every time, housing policy and homelessness. Google Scholar is giving me 227 results, 27,000 results rather. So they've got housing policy and street homelessness in Britain, homelessness in the United States, policy considerations, homelessness and housing policy, and musical chairs, et cetera, et cetera. Now, it's not as robust in terms of how you can play around with it. So it does have time filters on the side, and that's about it, right? I can't limit this to subject area or where the people who wrote it are from or those kinds of things. So what I have to do with Google Scholar is play around a little bit more with what I actually put in that search box. And I'll talk about that as we go. But Google Scholar is an incredibly powerful tool. One of the things you can do is you can see how many people have cited that paper. So this is a way to kind of expand your search. So this article, Housing Policy and Street Homelessness in Britain, has been cited by 95 articles that they can find on Google Scholar. And this just sort of expands what I can find that's really related to that first article. And it also has its own little related articles section, which will sort of be a combination of things that have cited it, what it's cited, and those kinds of similar terms. So it's another way to expand your search. It's just a little bit different than the other two. And then the one last one, I'm just going to show this one live quickly. If you're looking specifically for health-related things, PubMed Central is an open access database of a lot of health research. Most of the major funders for health research in Canada, the US, and Europe require that health research is publicly available, because obviously health research is in the public interest. So PubMed Central is the main place that you'll find it. So if you're looking for things like diabetes interventions or those kinds of things, or public health impacts on homelessness, then PubMed Central will be likely to have the health-related things. I'm going to try just homelessness in general. I'm going to talk about the term as we go later too. But so it's got 24,000 articles on it, and these will all slightly be public health related. So the first one, Solving Homelessness from a Complex Systems Perspective, Insights for Prevention Responses, is published in a public health journal. And a lot of these will be coming from, so third one, mental disorders and the use of primary health service, you know, it's going to be tied into health in some way or another. As a side note, please don't tell your doctors I said this, but PubMed Central is also a good place if you have any questions about like a medication that you're receiving, or a treatment you're receiving, or a diagnosis you might have received, because it is, instead of just the internet, it is healthcare practitioners and people in the health fields writing about it. So those are the main places that I go to try to find free articles. If I'm not doing the, if I'm not using my little buttons on my extension. But a little bit about what we're actually putting in that search bar. So interactive or not, what does the search look like for you? For me, what a search looks like is I think that I have got a brilliant idea and I type it into a search box, and then I don't find anything and I have to rethink what I typed in. There's all these methods that we like to talk about in the library world, which is using keywords or subject headings, or searching through those citations, like I mentioned, looking at the actual structure of databases and browsing. They're all very great and esoterical. We call it pearl growing. So you take one idea, you look around it for other related terms, and I guess you grow a beautiful necklace in the end. But really what it looks like is very messy. So the actual practice of doing searches is we might start with our one phrase, which was housing policy and homelessness. And we do a bunch of searches and we find a bunch of relevant things, but maybe we notice they're actually not that relevant. So we want to narrow it down. Now, in Google Scholar, you can use quotation marks around something to say, I want this exact phrase in this order. So I don't want just like anything that mentions housing and policy. I want something that specifically mentions housing policy in that order. And that makes it more specific. So it narrows down the amount of results we got. I don't know if you saw it went from 200,000 to 32,000, but hopefully what it's done is made those results a little bit more relevant. I'm not going to read through 32,000 results anyway, never mind 200,000. So we're kind of getting it a little bit closer. Now, we also probably want to add Canada here if that's what we're interested in, because we're looking at a big global thing. So adding Canada in narrows our results again. We're now down to 11,000. It's still more than I'll ever look at, but we're getting closer.
I'm just going to interrupt. So we're still on the slideshow.
Oh, shoot. I'm so sorry. No wonder you can't see what I'm doing. Okay, I will very quickly show you again just what I did there. Okay, housing policy and homelessness, we've got 227,000 results. If we put quotation marks specifically around housing policy, we're going to go down to 32,000 results. And if we add in Canada, we're going to go down to about 12,000 results. So we're getting narrower and more specific in our search. We can also combine that with the date at the time. If you're looking for something really specific on a website, like on a Government of Canada website or something like that, you can actually use Google terms to add in site. Sorry, you won't be able to see that, that's fine. So if we want to say, look at Canada.ca, I think it is. Let's see. So we actually got 2 results from the main Government of Canada website that are specifically talking about housing policy, homelessness, and Canada, and are on the government site. See, I've just put in site canada.ca. The other thing you can do is add minus site. So if you're getting a bunch of results from something that you don't like or you're not interested in, you can get rid of those results by adding that site. There were only 2, so it's not really changing my result much. As a total side note, if you're doing an image search and all the images you're getting are coming from Pinterest, you can do this to get rid of Pinterest images. So site or minus site work in Google. And then and works too. So and is saying, I want both of these terms to always appear. The one thing you can, another thing you can do though is instead of and, you can use or. So or means there are 2 words that mean the same thing. And I'm okay with results for either of them. So sometimes houselessness or unhoused would be used instead of homeless. And those are ways that you can sort of say, can you look for both of those terms? Google actually kind of naturally does this. It's not very specific. It's what we call a fuzzy search. But other searching might not do that. So dimensions will get different results for sure if we do that. Google might sort of naturally be saying if something's related to homelessness, it's also related to unhoused people. But you can see this actually really changed our results as well. So a couple of options there in terms of changing our searches. Quotation marks are kind of the most useful one. They're also very useful if you're looking for an exact title of something, like an exact title of an article or a book. Alt-tab doesn't work. So back to the presentation. And the other thing I really recommend you do, and this is a hard, actually, it sounds really easy, but it's maybe the hardest thing I'm recommending, which is try to keep track of what you've searched. So write down that your first search was housing policy and homelessness. You got whatever, 12,000, 20,000 results, but they weren't that relevant. So then you write down housing policy, homelessness, and Canada, and you get more results. And you start filtering up by public health. And that seemed pretty good, but it didn't get everything. You just kind of keep a log of this. And it's really, really helpful because it kind of forces you to slow down and pause and just change tactics if you have to. There is no such thing as a perfect search the first time you try it. And instead of forcing yourself to go through 200,000 results, which might not all be relevant, it's worth it to take the time and kind of like play around with it a little bit. The other thing is I find that after I read an article or two, I get new ideas for keywords. So I read an article and they are talking about services for the unhoused. And then I say, okay, so maybe homelessness isn't the only phrase that people are using in this. Let me try unhoused as well. And then maybe I'm more likely to get actually direct service providers, because that's the preferred term by service providers. You sort of like get a little bit of a feel for it. And it as long as you're willing to approach it that way, it's a lot less frustrating. I repeat this to myself every time I talk about this, because I still do this mistake where I'll just be like, no, the words I said are the words I want, and why am I not getting the results I want? So take a breath, Brianne, and go back and try something different. Yeah, and then finally, if you're working on a project with other people, where you're trying to share the articles you found with other people, a tool that's really useful for that, and it's totally free, is called Zotero. It's like 90% user-friendly, and then that last 10% is really tough to learn. But what it does is, again, you can just put it in your browser, and when you find articles you like, you can click on the Zotero button and it will save it to a library for you. So then you know, oh, I've got a nice folder here, and this whole folder is on things to do with housing policy, and I can go and see all the things that I found in one nice folder, and I can actually share that folder with other people. They can add to it too if you want to have an actual collaborative project. And it does allow you to put the actual PDF, so the actual copy of the article text, into your library as well, so that everybody's not trying to track down the article to read. It's right there. And again, if you're doing any kind of health research, it actually also will show you if a study's been retracted. So if there is a problem with any of the study or the information, Zotero will show you that, hey, no, the scientists had to withdraw this because there was a problem with their data, or there was a problem with their statistics or interpretation. So it is, although I should say sometimes retractions happen because people get mad at each other and like argue about which author's name needed to be in which place. So it's, you do have to do a bit of digging to find out why it's been removed. But it is a very handy feature too. And yeah, that's all I've got in terms of prepared stuff, but I'm happy to sort of talk through any problems you've encountered or frustrations you've encountered, or just answer any general questions too.